Looks like we're live, and it looks like people are coming into the space. So we're going to give people a few minutes to gather into the space, and then we will get started. Thank you all so much for being here today. Just a few more seconds, maybe as we're allowing people to come into the Zoom space here today. It looks like maybe folks have now entered. Got a few more going, maybe just about 30 more seconds. Okay, maybe we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody, to this first program of our series, Transforming Knowledge into Action, a programming series based on the Anti-Racism Toolkit published in the summer of 2020. I'm Dr. Carlton Green. I am the Director of Diversity Training and Education here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Maryland. It's really my honor to be able to be the person welcoming you into this conversation. Before we move forward into the conversation, I really want to pause here with the land acknowledgement that we've been using here at the University of Maryland as we get our program started. And so if you will just take a moment and allow me to share this with you. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who are among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on the indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please now take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brought us together here today. Thank you. We hope that you will also reflect on wherever the land that you find yourself and who are the people who that land was stolen from. As we begin this conversation, I also want to give a special shout out to those in our community who are participating here as a part of some learning communities that we started around this anti-racism toolkit. I also want to give just a really, really special recognition to the folks who have been working on this. Jasmine Pichardo, who's the Assistant Director of Diversity Training and Education, Sika Wheeler, who's also an Assistant Director in the area for Programming and Engagement, and Maya Walker, who is the Graduate Assistant who's been supporting this effort. I'm just really, really grateful to these three women of color who have poured so much of themselves into not only the toolkit, but forming this programming and being very thoughtful about how it is that we want to bring this to our community such that people might actually begin to experience not only intellectual change, but maybe behavioral change, okay? So again, thanks to them, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. As we move into this conversation, I just want to say a few things about anti-Blackness from an article that I read by Crystal Williams and some of her colleagues. It's an article entitled Stories Untold, Counter-Narratives to Anti-Blackness and Deficit-Oriented Discourse Honoring HBCUs. In it, they describe anti-Blackness this way: the long-standing and persistent cultural disregard for Black people in America. It's society's preoccupation with striving toward Black social death. In addition to that, they also call it the erasure of Blackness from all forms of social death, as Black people are positioned as the embodiment of the problem. It's the persistent imagery and discourse that construct Black people and culture as devoid of value. So as we enter into this conversation, not only about racism, but a special form of racism, anti-Blackness, we invite you to really pay attention to these two brilliant scholars that we've invited today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sika, who's going to introduce our speakers. Sika?
Thank you so much, Carlton, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm I can't really express how excited I am and also just like really eager to get into this conversation today. I am going to just make a couple of notes really quickly about how I'd love folks to sort of remain present in the conversation, and then we'll go into speaker bios. So just wanting to note in terms of different accessibility needs that people might have in this space, and the need to take care of yourself, and the fact that we're all in different spaces, although we're sort of sharing this event space today. Please take care of yourselves. If you need to go run into the bathroom, get some water, do whatever you need in order to stay present, we definitely encourage that. And then the other piece is about just sort of being mindful as we go through the conversation today of your body, how your emotions are sort of coming up in response to some of the things that we're talking about. I know a lot of times at universities, we can sort of have these really great, deep intellectual conversations that we just blow through, and we don't really sit with what we're saying or how it's impacting us. So I will also try to model that practice as I moderate today. And then the last piece, housekeeping piece, is if you could submit questions through the Q&A. We'll have about 60 minutes of the conversation today with our speakers, and then we'll have a chance to have a Q&A portion at the end, about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on where we are at that point. So definitely use the Q&A function, but try to the best of your ability to remain present in the conversation as we're having it. We'll definitely sort of let you know when the Q&A is about to, when we're about to come up to that point, and then you can submit your questions. All right, so let's get into speaker bios, and I will share my screen very briefly so that folks are able to read along. And actually, Maya, could you give me screen sharing capabilities really quickly? Sorry. Great, thank you. Okay, so with us today, we have Dr. Chinyere Oparah, who began her tenure as Provost and Dean of the Faculty at Mills College in 2017, after serving for almost 20 years on the Mills College faculty and chair, and as chair of the Ethnic Studies Department. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, raised in the south of England, and with roots in Southeast Nigeria, Oparah's educational background includes the study of languages, literature, philosophy, sociology, ethnic studies, and community development. During her tenure at Mills College, Oparah has also co-created the Public Health and Health Equity Program at Mills, participated in successful efforts to establish a queer studies program, and co-led the college's transgender initiative, which led to Mills becoming the first women's college to adopt a trans-inclusive admissions policy. She is author of the article Challenging Complicity, the Neoliberal University and the Prison Industrial Complex, which was included in the Anti-Racism Toolkit, part of the reason, among others, that we invited her to speak today. This is only one example of the numerous books, book chapters, and journal articles she has authored and edited, just to name a few, and I'll emphasize here a few out of the many. These include co-editing activist scholarship, anti-racism, feminism, and social change, Color of Violence, the Insight Anthology, and most recently, she co-authored Black Women Birthing Justice, Battling Over Birth, Black Women in the Crisis in Maternal Health Care, a human rights report and social media campaign based on a 5-year-long participatory action research project about Black women's experiences of pregnancy and childbirth in California. Thank you for being here, Dr. Oparah. Also with us today is Dr. Sarah Mayorga. She is a qualitative sociologist who studies racial inequality, urban neighborhoods, and Latinx migration, currently serving as assistant professor of sociology at Brandeis University. Her research engages with multiple arenas of racial inequality, including social life in multiracial spaces, whiteness in academia, and racial capitalism. She has also developed a framework for diversity ideology in the article, The White Centering Logic of Diversity Ideology, which we included in the Anti-Racism Toolkit. This framework captures the particular beliefs and behaviors of white people who pride themselves in valuing diversity, yet still enact norms of white supremacy. Sarah's newest book project is an analysis of racial capitalism in urban space, discussing the interconnections of structural racism and capitalism in shaping life in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her in-progress book, Urban Shifts, Racial Capitalism in the Queen City, analyzes the experiences of residents from 2 working-class Cincinnati neighborhoods to understand how processes of racial capitalism shape what residents say, how residents interact with their neighbors, and the practices of neighborhood institutions, such as neighborhood associations and local police. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Mayorga. And I'll pause here before we get into the questions just to ask, is there anything that the both of you might want to add? I know your bios are pretty extensive, and I know that they can in some ways sort of focus in on things that you've authored and what your sort of professional roles are, but I know that there's so much more to the work that you do.
I'm sure we'll be talking about all kinds of things that we've done, so I'm happy to just do that in the conversation. Thank you so much for the generous bio.
Great.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll just say, just because I'm shouting it from the rooftops, I was tenured last week, so I'm an associate professor now.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you added that. Thank you very much. All right, so let's get into it. So the first question here is really to ground us as people in this space. I know that there's lots of work that we, or that especially you two are involved in, and there's lots of concepts to cover. But just sort of thinking about where we are in the past year, right? In the context of this pandemic, in the context of academia, after all of the social rest over the summer and fall of, honestly, ongoing social unrest in this country. So it's not lost on us that we are asking ourselves and others to grapple with some really big issues through this programming, especially given today's focus on anti-Blackness. How have you navigated the vastness and at times overwhelming nature of trying to confront the realities of white supremacy, especially in the past year?
Are you going to pick, can you tell us who you want to answer? Because otherwise we're going to be polite and look at each other.
Well, unfortunately, you're already speaking, Dr. Oparah. So.
Okay, so it's me. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. I can see there's 127 people in the room, and I can't see your faces, which is really strange. But I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you so much to Sika, who's been doing so much of the work behind the scenes, and Maya, and also Carlton for such a wonderful, warm welcome. And thank you all of you in your community who are working with some of the questions that I've been grappling with in my work. I also just want to start out with, in the spirit of Carlton's introduction, by just acknowledging that my feet are on Ohlone land. I'm actually in Wichin, otherwise known as Oakland. That's the Ohlone name. And I've learned so much from Ohlone elders, activists, and our own elder in residence at Mills that I want to acknowledge have been an important part of my journey, my anti-racism journey around challenging anti-Blackness. And also the reminder for me that this work that we do to end, not just challenge anti-Blackness, is deeply connected to Indigenous struggles for decolonization and for sovereignty. And I try to see myself and to do work that puts me in solidarity with that. So thank you so much for that opening. I did look at your question and thought the last year, and then I just had to go to, no, the last 50 years. Okay, I'm aging myself here, sorry. But it hasn't been 1 year, right? For those of us in the room who experience anti-Blackness every day. And so I just had to go back, actually, and because the past is in the present. And I'll give you a story to tell you what I mean by that. And I apologize, I'm a storyteller. I think it just goes with the West African roots. So we get to the detail where we're going in the end, but there might be a little story on the way. So I consider myself a bit of a griot. So, last week I was on a Zoom call. We all are on Zoom calls all the time. And we were Zoom bombed, which is getting more unusual. I'm finding we're getting better at preventing that, but we were Zoom bombed. Somebody jumped on the call, and as a Black woman was speaking, started saying, "You're an N-word, you're an N-word," over and over, or shouting actually. And then the host managed to throw them off, right? And then I think it was another Zoom bomber, because they're getting more sophisticated, jumped in because I didn't recognize the name, and it started saying, well, we really need to look at the pain that this person is going through and why the trauma that they're going through that is leading them to use that kind of language. And I think we need to stop the meeting and talk about this, which to me was just a more sophisticated way of completely derailing the work, right? To focus on this question, because of course, what happened then was a few of the folks who consider themselves allies in working against anti-Blackness kind of took the bait and wanted to talk about, or at least engage with this individual around whether we should be focusing on the pain that this white supremacist was going through and why they were doing this, right? And then, you know, quite a few of the Black folks on the call were just triggered, right? And remembering things from the past and furious that we would even think that the moment right now was to focus on this white supremacist. And it successfully derailed the meeting for a bit until we were able to rail it in and rein it in and move forward. And I raise that story because this is what we're living right now, right? I don't know how many of you have been on one of those Zoom bomb calls full of white supremacists, like vitriol and disgusting speech, but I think it's a lot of us. And it is, of course, we've all seen it on the steps of the Capitol and inside the Capitol, right? So this is not something that's unusual, but what happened to me after that, as I reflected on that, is that I realized, to speak to your point, Seeker, about showing up with our bodies, that my whole body was impacted by that experience, right? I was just listening and you know, there was no visual of this person, but my whole body was impacted, and I felt viscerally what it was like to be in elementary school the day after there was a white supremacist fascist rally in my hometown in the south of England. And a lot of the kids in my class were taking to that rally with their parents who were supporting this, right? And the next morning, they learned some language at that rally. And that was the first time I experienced white people, very little white people, fired up behind the N-word and set on inflicting violence on me and that handful of Black people in my class, right? And so that experience of anti-Blackness really is deeply personal, it's deeply intimate, it's deeply embodied, right? And whenever we come to spaces and read about it and discuss it in class or talk about it, or we are oftentimes knowing our body anyway, like on some deep level, is reliving that work. And so that's part for me of the work of anti-Blackness as a Black person, is working through how I recognize that deeply personal and intimate impact, right? Holding folks accountable, slowing things down when people want to jump to, this is what we're going to do now, because we're coming from our heads, and slowing people down enough to say, no, we actually need to acknowledge, for those of us that it's actually in our bones, right? It's in our flesh. We've experienced the physical violence of it. And still doing the work and still engaging with folks who don't quite get that, because that's actually the reality of the work that we're doing today, right? That we haven't all been there. We haven't all experienced it. So all of that is to say that a few different things that I wanted to say about the work that I've been doing. You know, firstly, for me, it's really important to remember that anti-Blackness is transnational, right? This is not a unique, and that's not to say, that is really to say that we have more solidarity and more possibilities for strength than we perhaps imagine if we only think about ourselves within the confines of the United States. And that there also might be some things to learn from partnering, right? And also that there's ways in which anti-Blackness is deeply embedded in colonization, right? And the ongoing violence against the bodies of African people on the continent, in which I include some of my family, who experience it not through the kind of direct racist white supremacist violence that I described, but actually through the violence of endemic impoverishment as a result of the enforced underdevelopment of Africa and the stealing of African resources, including the oil that we use to drive around, right? And yet when we go home, you know, there's no electricity for the hospitals, even though we're producing the oil that's fueling what's happening over here. So just wanted to put that in the context, right? That's part of anti-Blackness too. So I'm trying to kind of explode the idea a little bit of what does anti-Blackness look like? It's intimate, it's personal, it's embodied, but it's also systemic. It's showing up in all of our university systems as well as the structures around us. And it's also structural, right? And it's also global and transnational. And I think that we can intentionally understand and unpack that and do real work in each of those levels. But I think for me, it's really important that we, as you said, somebody, I'm quoting, acknowledge the truth that's been buried. Carlton said that we acknowledge the truth that's been buried on all of those different levels as we engage with this work.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually going to maybe direct a more specific question to you, Dr. Mayorga, because I feel like I'm just really blown away by those levels that you're talking about. And it's exciting me. I'm feeling that in my body, right? Because I think that feels like the place that we never get to when we talk about anti-Blackness is, you know, it becomes about the sort of individual experience, which is important, but there's also the systemic nature. There's also the global nature. So thank you so much for that, Dr. Oparah. Dr. Mayorga, so how did you come into your understanding of anti-Blackness and how have you engaged it in your work?
Thank you. So actually, I see a lot of connection between what Dr. Oparah just shared too. So, I'm a non-Black Latina, but learning about anti-Blackness really has been central to my training as a sociologist. And that's not because sociology itself is particularly adept at this, but it was just really the context in where, I went to school. All of the classes that I loved in college in my department were cross-listed with Black Studies, which is, so I was also a Black Studies minor. Racial and ethnic relations, African-American women, the power of whiteness, all of these classes were really foundational for me and made sociology not just an intellectual exercise, but really inextricably tied to social change. Which I think is also something that learning from ethnic studies, that sociology, I think is getting on board in some ways recently, but I think we've learned a lot from our interdisciplinary, colleagues and peers. And so, and that's how I like to see my work, is really tied to not just the intellectual exercise. Of course, I'm a professor, that's part of it, but also hoping that it's one that moves people to see the world differently, to push beyond these individualistic, as we've been talking about, capitalist, racist, sort of common sense ideas that we're taught, particularly here in the US. And at the same time, I'm always learning, unlearning is probably more accurate, right? Anti-Blackness is, as Professor Oparah said, it's not just a US trait, right? It's global, and it exists in Latin America, which is where my family is from. And I think for a long time, I thought, well, my parents didn't really say any explicitly anti-Black things, right? Growing up, so I wasn't shaped by that in the way that other Latinxes describe. But over the years, I've also learned from reading Afro-Latinx scholars specifically to be more critical of even those seemingly innocuous terms and narratives about my own racialization as a Latina, right? And what that term itself obscures or elevates. And that anti-Blackness is not just about this explicit racism, but it's also about erasure and denial. What we were just saying earlier, right? About what gets hidden. And the erasure is really a fundamental feature, I think, of Latinx anti-Blackness. So I say, also that a key part of this journey has been humility, right? To be open-minded, to changing my mind, to learning new things, and then doing better, once you know better.
Thank you so much for naming that and for naming the piece around humility. So I'm wondering about, so we have this vast framework that we're talking through, and I think you bring up a lot of nuances around how Latinx as a positionality gets sort of racialized in really confusing ways and in contradictory ways that aren't always helpful. So I am wondering about why use the term anti-Blackness? Why use that as a framework, as something that we're trying to understand, as opposed to, say, like racism or exclusion, discrimination? Like there's lots of different ways that we talk about oppression. Why focus in on anti-Blackness? And I'll go to you, Dr. Oparah.
Thank you for that great question. This is such an important question for me because I've actually spent a lot of my political activist life trying to find language and context in which we can organize across difference as people of color. And so I was involved in the Black women's movement in Britain in the 80s, and we were actually identifying the word Black in this really kind of radically different way that incorporated the major communities of color in the UK at the time, which were South Asian from India and Pakistan, and African and Caribbean. And so we identified as African or Caribbean or so on and so forth, but then we actually used Black as this kind of umbrella term. And, it came over from the US actually. And we were like, okay, they embedded it to, replace various old terms that they had. We're just going to adopt it and do something different. So it was a really interesting time. And then of course, coming over to the US, I got very involved in the movement around critical resistance and to end violence against women with insight, and was working very closely with Angela Davis, who was a key part of actually creating the terminology of women of color intentionally to try to create this sort of umbrella. So I named that to say that we shouldn't take for granted that we actually even have the possibility of language that helps us to think in terms of coalitions, right, as POC. I think that's really important. So I hold that with some honor, and I think that work was hard, and it wasn't obvious that folks with such different, like what you just said, Sarah, like that we would have these great differences and that would somehow think that we should work together to fight this thing, right? It wasn't obvious because we also had such differences between us in terms of some of those conflicts that you highlighted. So it was important to do that work. And then there was a way in which that terminology and that way of organizing sometimes began to erase the very specific experience that I named at the beginning, right? This very specific experience of racial terrorism associated with anti-Blackness and the ways in which Black people feel that in our bodies is a very, very concrete form of racism that it's not the same as other types of racism. And we need to be able to name that. The very specific journey, long journey, right? Through slavery, through colonization on the continent, are very specific, experiences that, that lead to the very things that, there was that great quote that I think Carlton read at the beginning. Apologies, maybe Thika, you read it. Anyway, the great quote that highlighted just the devaluing and how that culturally has been so normalized through slavery, and that's a concrete legacy. So I find that anti-Blackness is helpful and important to name that. Our students on campus find it really important because it gives them a framework to say, yes, we have, at Mills, they have JAMA, joining all Mills together, and it's all the affinity groups of color that come together. And then they have the Black Student Collective, and they're very much focused on highlighting an agenda around ending anti-Blackness. And so I think that's really critical that we have that language and that framing. And then I think I also just want to name this shift to BIPOC, right? That we were using POC, although interestingly in Canada, they never smushed Indigenous people into POC. They always had Indigenous or First Nations in POC because of recognizing that there's a unique recognition, acknowledgement of that identification with the land and that different experience that Indigenous folks have. And so we've separated out that indigeneity, recognized that, and then we've separated out that particular relationship to histories of slavery and colonization that Black have. And so we're beginning to try to have language that enables us to be in coalition, but to hold those different journeys and those different experiences with a lot of integrity.
Yeah, and I think for me, just to echo around the specificity is the really important part. And this question for me sort of, reminded me of some of the work that I've done on diversity. And it's really, in the US, how to get away from naming Blackness specifically, right? So I think the creation of diversity of itself was an attempt to get away from race-specific language and admissions by the Supreme Court. It's a way of it can be a way of watering down efforts to combat structural racism. And now we talk about diversity and people can claim that a room full of white men is diverse because they all have different life experiences. And that's true, right? But then what does that have to do with racial justice? So I think in similar ways, naming anti-Blackness helps us keep our eyes on the prize, right? That anti-Blackness is foundational to the United States and it undergirds a lot of our institutions. And that also the anti-Blackness is different than other forms of racial oppression, although it also intersects and shapes those oppressions, which is also a key part of, I think, our discussion today.
Can I just also add to that I do think that there's an important discipline to rooting ourselves and also in a critical ethnic studies frame and scholarship. And so what I mean by that is that sometimes I experience with some of my students that they've really been just embedded and imbued in reading and learning about African-American studies. And oftentimes, we're in Oakland, I have students that their parents were Black Panthers. So it's been from the get-go, the work of learning and understanding Latinx stories and journeys, or learning and understanding Asian American journeys and stories, and resisting the stereotypes that would actually divide us from being able to work together is actually perhaps different work and equally important work. So I want to just really, I come from critical ethnic studies background, and I try to deliberately and intentionally inhabit African-American studies, critical ethnic studies, and the African studies and kind of activist spaces, because I think that we learn from all of those spaces. So that's my one concern about the narrow focus on anti-Blackness, is that that people perhaps don't do the work of actually learning that as Black people on this land, we need to be understanding Indigenous colonization is an ongoing state, and that there are efforts by the very systems that we resist to co-opt us as Black people in part of ongoing colonization, right? To legitimize ongoing colonization through the apparent diversity by having us up on the stage, right? So I think that we need to, it's so important and critical for us to do more work, sorry, is it more work, but to do that work of critical ethnic studies as well.
Thank you so much for that. And that actually touches on a question that was sort of formulating maybe in my heart about thinking around, I'll say it this way, I work in diversity training and education, which is in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at UMD. And, obviously we get lots of training requests or sort of consultation calls around, okay, we're trying to do something different in our department. But we're having a lot of struggles with sort of understanding, what does this really look like systemically? How can we identify, like, where in our mission statement are we being racist, right? And I think anti-Blackness in particular is something that people are really struggling to wrap their minds around. So I wonder if we can take a slight detour and think about just what was a moment for you where you felt like you were able to really understand concretely what anti-Blackness looks like, outside of sort of, being mean to Black people, or, right? Because I think that I honestly feel like that's the image that people that brings to mind when people say anti-Blackness. But to really dig into how is it that you can identify how anti-Blackness is truly vast and connected to so many other oppressions. And I'll put that out to either one of you, please.
Yeah, I'll jump in here just because this is something I've been thinking about. So I have, like you mentioned in my introduction, I have this new book I'm working on racial capitalism, and it's a study of 2 working class neighborhoods in Cincinnati, one that's predominantly white and one that's multiracial. And so what I noticed is across these 2 contexts that residents, particularly white residents, were talking about we're not actually emphasizing Black, but we're saying that residents from the now gentrifying downtown neighborhood over the Rhine were coming into their neighborhoods and ruining their neighborhoods, right? So the downhill slope of these 2 working class neighborhoods was connected to this influx of residents from a historically predominantly Black neighborhood that is now gentrifying. So the code there was clear, right? It's these new Black residents are coming in and ruining our space. And so I interviewed Black residents from these neighborhoods, including the predominantly white one. There were also Black residents there. And I asked them where they're coming from, where they're living from, and they are not connected to downtown, right? But there's this narrative that these white residents were saying is, they didn't, these residents don't know how to live down there, and now they're the problem residents. They're getting pushed to us because no one cares about our neighborhood. But it's a totally fabricated story about movement. And I think, again, sort of shows the devaluation of Black peoples, right? And a completely ahistorical, disconnected understanding of gentrification, of capitalism, of exploitation, of disinvestment of that neighborhood, that why, maybe there was no grocery store in that neighborhood has nothing to do with the behavior of those residents, but has to do with sort of these capitalist logics that, again, are based in anti-Blackness and the devaluation of Black people. So for me, hearing this narrative from these residents and seeing that it had no basis in reality was one of those like real aha moments of the shape of anti-Blackness being different, or rather being distinct than just saying that, structural racism, right? Like this was because there are also Latinx residents in these neighborhoods, and they're framed in a different way than the Black residents. So that for me was sort of one of those, being able to see it tied to these larger processes of disinvestment, gentrification, and then also the micro, right? if you think that these new residents, if you're a white resident and you think these new Black residents are, the cause of disarray, then how are you going to treat that person, right? Are you going to be inviting them to be a part of this community? You've already decided that they're, they're not the same as you. So it's the micro, it's the macro, it's sort of this multi-level phenomenon, as Dr. Oparah, sort of laid out in the beginning.
Yeah, this is such an important question because it really gets to this question of why is it that in an institution or organization with well-meaning people who want to do the right thing by Black people can completely be discriminated against, right? So if we only understand the interpersonal and the personal aspects of anti-Blackness, we miss, we've got the tip of the iceberg and we've missed the 80% that's underneath, that's really structuring our experiences as Black people. So it's so important. And I think about the work of Professor Maggie Hunter, who's at Mills, and others have been doing work around Gen Z and Gen Z attitudes and understandings of race and racism. And what they've identified is that because of the particular ways in which, social media proliferates images of individual acts of violence towards Black people, and representations and images tend to be sort of soundbitey and memey, right? Not memey, but you know what I mean. So in other words, that they're sort of short, easily understood and visual. The Gen Z apparently tend to focus more on those sort of public slights, those public violences, those public and sort of things that you can visibly see, right? The racism, you can visibly see it happening in this moment. You can point your finger and say, that's where it happened. This is the perpetrator. This is the person who is victimized, right? And all of those things absolutely are happening and we have to fight against them. And people have to be held accountable for them. And also all of the other pieces, the policies, right? The ways in which, for example, Black students show up. This is the week, right, around about now when thousands of students across the country are being dropped from classes because they can't pay their bills, right? Like that happens. I think some of us are in that world and we understand that. And in this COVID moment, despite these higher education relief funds, many students, they've lost their income, their families have lost their income, they're being pushed out of higher education in this very moment. And we know that COVID has disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx communities, and that depending on where you are in the country, you're likely to see that it is our Black students, as well as our Latinx students in California anyway, who are the ones who are being pushed out disproportionately. So all of that is not because somebody in financial aid office, in your office, sat down and said, I don't think I want these students here anymore. It's not personal, it's structural, right? And that's, to me, we have to fight that, right? We have to fight that, and we can't fight that only by trying to change people's behavior. The reason why I think this is so important is because it speaks to what are the remedies that we try to create. Are we trying to do then diversity training? Okay, maybe we're going to make anti-racism training for the people in that office, right? Or are we understanding that this is a deep issue of economic justice, health justice, and that we actually need to fight to change those policies and practices that are putting our students into this situation in the first place? So that's why I'm so passionate about identifying the institutional, the structural, the systemic, because those are the things that are actually killing us as much as, if not more than, those individual acts of violence that we see, streamed on our phones.
Thank you so much. And I wrote down that name, Maggie Hunter, I believe it was, from Mills College, because I think that's really, really helpful research to be coming out right now. I know that we talk a lot about Gen Z is, more inclusive than ever, and they'll save us. And I think we're seeing something a little bit different. I would love to get into talking about moving away from sort of individual behavioral changes to trying to sort of identify structural responses or remedies to sort of the situation that we're in now. I can sort of hear in people's minds, like just thinking, well, what do we do about it? What do we do? That's always the question of, well, then how do we solve it? How do we end it? And I think I would like to sort of redirect that question to maybe to you specifically, Professor Oparah, because I know that something that I loved in Challenging Complicity was that you did offer some pieces around, these are the things that would have to change, and they're very big things, but there were some pretty concrete pieces laid out. So what does meaningful action in your mind, what does it look like in the university context, knowing that, we have Black Lives Matter statements, we have proposed policy changes around the relationship between campus police and the university. There's, talks about reparations and changing the names of buildings. Like, what does all of this mean for you, and what would something more meaningful look like?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Well, first of all the work we do is meaningful and important. So we just need to acknowledge that. And sometimes we look back at it 5 years later or 10 years later and we say, that wasn't the most impactful work I could have done, but it was the best work I could do in that moment, So I really want to lift up everybody who's, working for racial justice and intersectional racial and gender justice, right? That's all important. And being courageous. And not taking the easy path, because it's not always easy to do this work. So I just want to take a moment to honor, acknowledge, and lift up everybody who's doing this work. When we understand these different levels, then we can be perhaps more targeted in making sure that we're addressing each of those levels. And some of it really is sort of at that institutional policy level that you mentioned. For example, at Mills, when I became provost, and just after 5 years ago, the students were complaining that faculty, some of the faculty in some of the departments were exhibiting a lack of understanding of Black experience. They weren't bringing it into the curriculum. There were incidents where, for example, somebody would be reading a literary text and the N-word would come up and they would just read it as if it was just a regular word and there was no impact, those kind of things. And the students wanted something to change. And I said, yes, something needs to change. And it's not just about doing diversity training with those faculty, because you have to, first of all, let's take a step back and ask, why are there no Black faculty in that department? Right? So we kind of sometimes get focused in on the behavioral change of individuals and then forget that there's a whole structural reason as to why universities were established not for Black people, and certainly not for Black people to get PhDs and go on and become professors, right? And so there was a way in which we had to completely overhaul and throw out the way in which we were hiring new faculty, and make sure that regardless of who was on the search committee, so if I'm getting too in the weeds, but you faculty who are on this call right now, the politics of search committees, that regardless of who was on the search committee, we were asking questions that allowed faculty of color and Black faculty to articulate their expertise and their knowledge in supporting Black students, and that would be something that would be counted and valued, right? Not just where you got your PhD from, but what have you done with Black students, right? Or that we looked at the long list, or we looked before the long list at the pool, and we said, why do you only have 2 Black people in this pool? You have 100 candidates, and there was only 2 Black people in the whole country and world that were interested in this job. So let's take a pause and ask, where did you advertise? What networks were you connecting with? Did you talk to any Black people in the discipline to ask them to tell their contacts? Because you don't have any in your department, right? And things completely changed. And we ended up that year recruiting majority faculty of color and several Black faculty. So I just think that those are some of the ways in which, when we ask a different question, right? We sort of say from, well, why is this white faculty member who has very little experience and understanding of didn't study African-American studies, probably wasn't even on the curriculum when they were at university, right? Why are we expecting them to diversify and change the curriculum? Yes, we certainly need them to do some work. I'm not letting anyone off the hook here, but that's not sufficient to actually have a department that reflects our students. So that's just sort of one tiny moment or one tiny snapshot. But fundamentally, this is really about realigning our universities, not as spaces of exclusion and spaces that are supporting and replicating the dominant elite, but instead as spaces that are using and mobilizing our resources in support of social movements, right? And those social movements, Black Lives Matter, but also the movement to abolish prisons. So I had to throw that out there. Also movements to end violence against women and women of color, Indigenous folks, so all of those, I think that to me is the critical piece. How are our resources aligned? Are our resources aligned in service of social movements, racial justice, or are they aligned sort of as just supposedly neutral? Because if we're neutral, then we're supporting the status quo, because there is no neutral, right? It's either one, you're either staying as you are, when we know how we were founded. I don't know the history of Blackness and in terms of Maryland specifically, but I do know that in the Bay Area, these universities were not founded for Black people and have had a long struggle, starting in the 60s to actually have any concrete Black presence. The Black Panthers came and supported our Black students in the 60s in getting an ethnic studies department and getting Black faculty. These were struggles that were long fought, right? And so that struggle is incomplete and we need to continue to advance it with social movements.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to the question of how are our resources aligned? And I'm glad that you brought abolition into the conversation, because I think that the sort of increased engagement with abolition this past year has had people asking that question, right? It's an important question. Before we get there, though, I do want to give you a chance, Dr. Mayorga, to talk about diversity ideology a little bit, because I think it's a great entry point into thinking about the solutions that we often propose and why they often are not really effective, or maybe they're sort of running us in circles of sort of the same conversations, the same sort of repeating chronic issues. So let me quote just a bit from this article. Diversity ideology frames exclusion as the cause of racial inequality and fair representation as the solution. It allows whites to construct a positive white identity as open-minded and accepting of difference, or organizations as innovative and cutting edge while maintaining the social and legal benefits of systemic whiteness. So how does understanding this framework of diversity ideology that you've put forth help us identify different strategies in response to issues that we have on campus?
Thanks so much. So I think for me, one of the key areas is how we're defining the problem, right? And I think that's where the solutions fit in. And this, I think echoes some of what Dr. Oparah said, that, not seeing this as short-term, individual level, behavior-based reactions, but really thinking systemically and institutionally, right? So for example, I think one of the trends that I've seen is that often we have, I would say before this, this past summer with the Black Lives Matter protests, it tended to be that there was a racist incident on campus, there would be some scrambling on campus to try to address that specific incident, and then we'd move on, right? So it's really sort of diversity as public relations, to sort of say, we've figured it out, we're okay now, let's move forward. And there's no real engagement with the fact that these tended to be patterned incidents and behaviors. It was never just a one-off thing, but particularly if you take the perspectives of students of color, particularly Black students, seriously, we know that these are not just one-off incidents, but are sort of regular occurrences of marginalization and devaluation. So I think one of the keys is taking a historical approach, understanding sort of the history of that institution, who it was meant to serve, and who it's serving now, right? And I think that thinking about power is a key part of this reframing of diversity, that it's not so much about, well, the doors are open, everyone's welcome, but really about why I think back, the diversity ideology sort of was an emergent theory for me when I was doing my work in a predominantly, a multiracial neighborhood. And you would have a predominantly white neighborhood association. And the neighborhood association couldn't explain why people of color from the neighborhood weren't participating. And so their stance was, we welcome everyone, but it was a white homeowner association. And so it was really starting, as I spent more time in the neighborhood, it became very clear that in the activities that they put on, in the way that they framed issues in the neighborhood, this was a white homeowner association, right? That I think we also have to be clear that that it's diversity is not just about differing perspectives, but that sometimes these perspectives are in conflict, right? And that we really have to think about who are we in service to, right? So is this in service of power? Or is this in service of trying to upend these structures of oppression? And so like in the neighborhood example, are we going to be on the side of homeowners, or are we going to be on the side of renters in this debate about the use of space, et cetera? So I think asking those questions is really important, because oftentimes we get into these discussions around representation. And I think representation matters and is important. And I think psychologically matters to us, of course, but I think it's just the first step. And we often think of it as the last step. Okay, now you have people of color represented on the board of trustees or in the president's office, or wherever, but that doesn't necessarily again institutionally create this change that we would like to see. So I sort of use this clumsy metaphor that it's not just about getting a seat at the table, it's asking, but then the table stays the same. You know, it's really thinking about why does this table exist? Why does it look this way? What if we want it to be a chair, you know? And if the chair better services the whole community. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes, please.
Dr. Mayorga's point here about power is totally central to what we're talking about, right? I had the great honor this last year of being one of the National Equity Project's Leading for Equity Fellows. It's just such an amazing program. I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in doing this work in community. And you know, they really start us thinking about how are decisions made. And that is actually central. And this concept of white supremacy culture that some of us have been talking about, right? That it doesn't matter who's around the table. If the culture in the room is white supremacy culture, then you're going to be forced to accommodate to it in some way, right? And that might be that the way decisions are made, you know, focuses power in the room. And then there's all the people outside of the room who are not getting access to participating in that decision making. You know, I like to use this little slogan, you know, we make better decisions together. It sounds really sort of benign. It doesn't upset anyone, doesn't, you know, but it's really pretty profound. Because fundamentally, the ways in which universities and pretty much most institutions in society are organized is that we don't make better decisions together. We want to make the decisions, and you're going to stay out there, and we're going to make decisions and maybe tell you later, right? And so that actually is a fundamental part of the problem with this idea of like diversity as the solution. We need to transform the ways in which decisions are made and the way in which power is conceptualized, because basically we think about power as it's in the room and we're outside the room trying to get some, right? And then when we get some, we forget that we can't just use it in the same way as the people in the room. So the idea is really to think not about, you know, power over power to make decisions, but instead to think about power with how do we build collective power. This is a fundamental principle of Insight Women of Color Against Violence. It's this notion of building power collectively through building and bringing in more and more people into the context in which we're building, we're innovating, we're creating answers, you know, and we're not demanding solutions. That's very much work that we do in activist movements, although we have to catch ourselves sometimes because we start replicating those hierarchical structures even there, right? And so it's that, I think that to me is the critical piece. Like, how do we think about who has power in the room? How do we actually look at a room and really acknowledge these are the power differences here. This is what we're going to do in terms of our process of engagement to make sure that all voices can actually participate and that decisions can be made collectively. That's really hard for us. We're not used to that in universities. And despite the fact that we say that we have this amazing shared governance you know, structure that other organizations, corporate sector don't have. And so therefore we have, you know, we're much more egalitarian. Even our shared governance structures on the faculty side, you know, we look at our senates and oftentimes we find that the chair is consistently a white male, and that the adjunct faculty aren't even given a spot around the table, and that faculty of color, well, they're junior, so they didn't get elected, right? So we start replicating the very same structures even within our shared governance processes that are supposed to, you know, empower faculty to fully participate in the vision and mission around the college. And then we don't really oftentimes go and ask the students what they think. So, you know, and again, I'm not trying to sort of, I sound like I'm being super critical here, but I'm trying to really sort of acknowledge myself in this, you know, that this is a struggle that we all face and that we all have to work through.
Yes, thank you. I mean, thank you for that last piece, especially I'm thinking about that language of replicating the sort of these hierarchies that we're trying to upend, or replicating the type of power that we're used to seeing and that we're used to operating under. And then in my mind, I'm connecting that to the representation conversation. So just to kind of come back concretely to anti-Blackness, thinking about when there is representation, and you know, I even want to pause here just to say that the issue of representation is so crucial to me, because it does feel like it really is still the go-to when we talk about we need to change, you know, systemic racism on campus. The first thing is about we need to hire a certain number of faculty or have a certain number of students, or, you know, for instance, in the context of University of Maryland, we're in Prince George's County, And so there's this idea of, well, the university itself is predominantly white, but then all of the counties around us are predominantly of color or Black in particular. And so we need to have this like numerical matching thing to the county around us. And that feels important, but it also feels like it is sort of bypassing that question of what is that culture that's in this university, right? And I even think about earlier, maybe in the summer, Angela Davis had said, not wanting, just because people are Black doesn't mean that I want to unite with them, right? And so this idea of like, there are nuances and, you can have representation and yet that person who's in that position of power, who's a Black person or who's a woman of color, who's queer, whatever, can still be representing and replicating that culture. So I wonder if we can maybe pause and sort of massage that out a little bit of how you've seen that happen, whether it's sort of nationally in the universities that you're at or universities that you've been at, where this representation thing actually ends up being the thing that keeps us stuck in the culture that we're trying to challenge.
Let me just speak to this a little bit because I'm actually really passionate about our university serving Black students. To me, it's absurd that we're still, at this moment, facing universities across the country where, Black students have to be the special Black student to get accepted or, that has not been addressed. So that to me, that's not, how can I put it? That's not the solution, that's the baseline, right? Like that, just to have, access to our universities for our Black students. And then that just feeds on into our professoriate, right? Because they're the students who are getting PhDs who are becoming faculty. So to have Black faculty and Black students in sufficient numbers and sufficient proportions, compared to the state that we're in, compared to the area that we're in, to me is a baseline, right? We must do that work. And I just want to remind us that no change in universities, to me, that's really, really profound has ever happened except for through student organizing. So it's the students being in the room actually that they then say, this climate is not going to work for us. We're not going to put up with this. We're getting out there and we're protesting. And so that to me, I can trust that once my Black students are there, they're going to do the work to turn things inside out. And they're going to have that fine allyship with their Black faculty. And yeah, there's going to be a few Black faculty who are going to be like, well, I'm a little worried. I don't want to stand with you. Just a quick anecdote. This is going back a few years at Mills. I don't know, it was in the last 8 years, I forget the exact year. There was an incident where somebody posted on a college official social media. Was it official? It was on a college social media site anyway. And they posted a rape hate statement on this social media site. It was taken down by the college, but the students felt that it didn't come down soon enough. They believed that it was somebody within the college community that had put it there. And it was untraceable. It was one of these people who put something with, I don't know, fake email. I don't know how that works, but you couldn't trace them. And the students, it just was like a tipping point. And they had a big protest for a few days. It was a silent protest. And it was like, can you hear me now? And they were standing on the steps. And I was the Black student faculty advisor at the time. And, and I was, we were the students were doing the thing. It wasn't for the faculty to be there, but there was one day, it was the second day, I think it was. And I just saw some of my students and the leaders were just like feeling you could just see how hard it was, right? Like how difficult it was just standing there. And I just felt cool to just go stand with them. And I kind of like made a few little signs, like, shall I? And they were like, yeah. So I went up and I stood and then we were doing the Black Power salute. And of course, that's when the university photographer came by, took the photo, I'm the only faculty there doing the Black Power salute with the Black students, and then it was on the front page of the student newspaper. And so there's that moment in which, the board members are looking at that and say, well, who is that, and it doesn't matter, right? Because I'm not going to lose tenure because I stood into the Black Power salute. Maybe I look a little less powerful to some people on the campus and a little bit more scary, and I've had a white faculty member say to me once when I picked them up and I saw them on campus and they were going towards the front gate and I was driving. So I just stopped and said, hey, you want to jump in? I'll just give you a ride up. And we chatted, and at the end, he actually said to me, I always thought you was kind of scary, and now I realize you're not. I was like, oh my God, you don't realize how many microaggressions was in that nice statement that you just made. But so yeah, you get to maybe look a little scary to people, and that's okay. So so all of that is to say that yes, as we do this work, we have to have that vibrancy, that energy, that power that comes with the people power, in our spaces. And that will be the starting point. And for those of us who are seeking to be in solidarity and allyship, and for myself as an administrator now, I actually have to be in allyship with Black students. I'm kind of in a different positionality. And so I have to be really intentional about that allyship. We have to sort of think through, what that looks like. I'm sorry, I went off on a bit of a detour for your question, Seeker, but I just got really passionate about this thing about Black student activism and how important it is to transport to the way forward, actually.
Yeah, so the question was around representation and sort of when we've seen that as sort of a roadblock. I think the most common example that I talk about with my students is the election of President Obama, right? Which was, I think, really powerful symbolically, but also, I think can help us see what we mean when we talk about institutional and structural change, right? Sort of was his election, really the sort of the push for this post-racial America that never really came, right? And so I think that's one sort of example. But for me, I also don't want to diminish representation as an important thing, right? So I think can we hold those two things together, that, representation matters, of course, but also that really it's just the beginning of the conversation. And I think for me, the helpful reframe is always around outcomes, right? Because I think the representation, it's sort of aligned with this idea of, this good intentions, right? Like, oh, okay, we're going to do sort of to show our, to show that we've done a good job here, but without having to do sort of the deep work of that deeper institutional, realignment. And I think that this is, I want to also highlight, this is not easy work, right? So I think about Sarah Ahmed, who's a philosopher. She talks about, when you name the problem, you become the problem, right? And I think that this is often around this work that can happen. And I think this is what Dr. Oparah is just, in part talking about. So how you can be sort of singled out, and then it becomes about people's discomfort with you rather than about the original issue, right? Or about the way that you responded or the way that you identified an issue. Yeah, I'm not sure that I exactly answered your question, but I think those are the things that sort of came to mind with this discussion.
I think the other piece is that the flip side of the question, or the flip side of the problem that we just articulated, is the disproportionate burden on Black faculty to be everything and do everything, right? Because when we make it about representation, then we have the one Black faculty in the business department. Sorry, business department, I'm sure you have a lot more Black faculty than that. But anyway, just picking that out randomly. And so now they have to advise all the Black students, and then they have to also be available late into the evening when the Black students have an issue that they need support around. And then now they also have to go out and do the guest lecture for recruitment because we want to show how diverse we are. So I think that that's the other problem with this idea of representation as a solution, is that it actually exploits our Black faculty and staff, and really puts this disproportionate burden on their shoulders to do this work, which then we feel called to do because we care, right? But then the burnout factor, is really key too. So I think that that's a piece that I also want us to hold, is how then do Black faculty, find support, find encouragement, find the kinds of boundaries that we need to have, while also knowing that there's never enough, and that the institution is not doing enough for our Black students, and that they do feel called to do the work.
Yes, I mean, there's so much in that statement that you just made, Professor Oparah, and I think it would be remiss of me to not sort of, as a light-skinned Black woman, also name the colorism that usually comes into play there if we're talking about anti-Blackness, and just thinking of the idea of being that scary Black woman, right, who put, the Black power fist on the steps, and how a lot of times that is the darker skinned sort of staff members, faculty, right, who essentially get thrown under the bus, right? That is received very differently than, for instance, if I'm, on the steps with the students giving a Black power fist. So I just feel like I really, that was sort of sitting on my heart as you were talking about that. I want us to shift in these last couple of minutes before we get into Q&A to thinking about values and alignment, and this idea of sort of who we are as individuals in these very complex and oftentimes problematic, to say the least, institutions. Just to read from Challenging Complicity, in that article, Dr. Oparah, you give an example from Atkin College of how sort of there's these anti-racist actions that people are taking part in on the campus, and at the same time, you know, there's this big donation to like build a new business school, right? That's coming from a donor that's connected to sort of military occupation. And so that was just one example, but there were so many examples in that article. There's so many examples that I'm sure all of us could think about of, you know, on one hand, as individuals or as groups, we're trying to embody sort of anti-racism or trying to challenge anti-Blackness or like all of these different ways of you know, putting our actions where our mouth is, so to speak. And at the same time, we're at these institutions that are often deeply connected to prison industrial complex, military industrial complex, like all sorts of things around, you know, that also doesn't go to say towards like the environment, the economic injustice, like all of these different things. So, you know, just coming back to the individual level of you two as people who are at institutions, how do you as an individual hold that tension of all of the stuff that we've just been talking about and identifying, and also being still at these institutions, right? Still a part of those processes. How do you make sense of that tension for yourself?
We're being polite. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I'll jump in. So I think this is a really great question. And I think there's two ways that I want to sort of address it. So the first is that, you know, obviously, even with these critiques, we're still subject to the logics and the organization in these structures, right? So I think and that's not just in that we're participating in these structures, but also how we can also replicate them ourselves, right? So I think just because we research it, or I should just own it myself, just because I research it doesn't mean that I don't also have to be sort of vigilant of my own, the way that these logics sort of seep in to my own thoughts and practices. And so I think one of the most important takeaways from this reframing of, I think a lot of the diversity talk around anti-racism is focusing on the action piece, right? Like, I think that's been the big push, is that anti-racism is an active sort of stance rather than just, you know, sort of a passive one. So I think obviously taking action that aligns with, you know, my values, and, you know, I think doing the best you can. And, you know, I talked a little bit about humility before, and for me, humility is not so much about, you know, making yourself small or second guessing yourself, which are actually things I'm trying to unlearn from, you know, growing up. But it's really, humility is about knowing that there are so many things that I don't know and that others can teach me, and that I'm going to screw up sometimes, but that the important thing is just to keep trying and to not be paralyzed by the sense of having to get it just perfectly right. So really taking the action. But I think that this is also where the community part is really important, because you also need people to hold you accountable, right? So not being, you know, alone. I think sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom, you know, sort of warns against this lone wolf, you know, activist, that's not really a thing, and it shouldn't be a thing, right? It's really this kind of organizing and activist work, or, you know, whether it's out our jobs or out, you know, out in our communities, it's communal, right? And Dr. Oparah has also talked about this, about the importance of building power in community with other people. And so I think that that's also part of this, is that the humility comes in part because of having people that hold you accountable, but also that you're accountable to, so that, you know, your actions are, you know, are not just something that affect you, but also affect other people. You know, and I'll leave it there.
You know, I like to name many people who've kind of helped me understand things. And actually, Gloria Ansel-Dewar is somebody who's really helped me to understand this. And, you know, she talks about being able to hold the both and the complexity of it all, right? And, you know, for her, she's thinking about that in terms of like the oppressor in her blood, you know, as somebody who has some white ancestry, as well as the indigenous and the Blackness in that identity too, right? That we kind of hold that complexity. So I kind of see that as a little bit helping me with the answer to this question, you know, but let me just sort of take a step back a little bit. So just over 2 decades ago, I was part of a little group in somebody's living room in Oakland, thinking about how we might advance the idea of a movement to abolish the prison industrial complex, you know, and at the time, it just seemed like a ridiculous concept to think that people could get behind that, other than the tiny little group of us in that room and a few friends and colleagues who are incarcerated, you know, you know, and we, you know, we got together and we were able to build, you know, that conference, Critical Resistance, that then pushed out and kind of expanded and became, you know, Critical Resistance is all over the country. And then, you know, people started talking about, and you began to see it in the just the mainstream press, that should they really build another prison here? And who are the interests behind that? And who's actually getting paid? And suddenly it was out there, right? And, so there's a way in which, you know, we sow some seeds and we do some work that we really can't imagine that 2 decades later, abolition is being discussed at all of the mainstream political levels, right? And then in fact, it's become something that's almost sort of a norm for us as Black activists and organizers to think that how could we possibly build the future and the world that we want if all our money is going into incarcerating our community? It just becomes like a normal common sense idea, but that wasn't the case at that time, right? So there's a way in which, and that work and that labor was done largely by academics and students, as well as organizers and activists from local community organizations. But a lot of it was the UC Berkeley campus that hosted us, and we didn't pay rent, you know? So that's a great example of, you know, directing the resources, the time, the energy, the physical space of the university to do something that's really meaningful and important, right? And that doesn't immediately manifest as transformative, but that actually does create meaningful change over time. But for me, you know, I'm at an institution, I only really seek out mission-driven institutions that are really committed to social justice, race and gender justice, because that's just where I feel, you know, most at home. But I actually respect everybody's choice in terms of where they're located, because no place is perfect. Mel's isn't perfect either, even though gender and racial justice is right at the forefront of what it is that who we are, you know, as an institution, and yet we still have our struggles, you know. So there is no perfect place, you know. But I do think that, you know, whatever institution we're in an institution that has the potential, and at moments actually is this incredible radical space where Black folks and our allies are imagining and building alternative futures. You actually are in that space right now, because here we are doing it, right? And on the very same day, your institution, my institution, is also a space that is, you know, oppressing or rather exploiting Black faculty, and maybe, you know, pushing out Black students, right, who can't pay or for other reasons. So it's the both and, it's the complexity of the both and. And yeah, I still believe that, you know, with my presence, with your presence, with the work that we're doing together, we can push ourselves more in the direction of imagining and building these radical alternative futures and abolitionist futures and liberatory futures, right? And continue to do that work. You know, otherwise, I'm just gonna, what am I gonna go, just sit in my living room? You know, there is nowhere, where is there to go that is a pure, radical, anti-racist space? It doesn't exist. And so I have to be in the world. And so I have to be in the world with you and do this work with you.
Thank you so much. And I do want to, before we get into the Q&A, I want to just name, I so appreciate your involvement in Critical Resistance. It's been a really important organization in my own political education. So I love that you named your involvement there. Maya and Jasmine, I think we're going to shift over to Q&A in these last couple of moments. If you haven't gotten your question in for our audience members, please do so now. But thank you so much. Jasmine, we'll go to you first.
Sure. Thank you both. This has been really enlightening and riveting, and so many gems shared. So immense gratitude. We do have a few questions. I'll start with one, and maybe Maya and I can trade off. I wanted to revisit the colorism question from an anonymous attendee who specifically asked it of Dr. Oparah, but I actually think given Dr. Mayorga's focus on anti-Blackness within the Latinx community, I think it's appropriate to open it up to you both. And so their question is, there seems to be an ongoing issue within the Black, and I'll expand it to the Black diasporic community in particular, as it pertains to colorism, that lighter or fair skin is seemingly more beautiful or better than darker skin. How have you experienced colorism within the Black diaspora community, and how would you approach these types of discussions personally and or professionally? So really just a way to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you so much. You know, this has been such a powerful journey for me because I've experienced the question of skin color in multiple transnational contexts where it actually has different meanings. So in the US, I apart from when I'm on the steps with students with my Black Power salute, because of my skin color, translate to many white people who have anxiety and white fragility as a more palatable Black person, right? That is part of the nature of colorism, right? And so that's something that I carry with me and I have to be accountable around, both in terms of how I then use my positionality to open doors, right? And how I also acknowledge when I'm in spaces, you know, how much space am I taking up? Which is kind of a common question that we all have to engage, depending on what kind of, it's a question of privilege, right? When we recognize that we have privilege, we have to think carefully about how we're taking up space and how we're, you know, opening up and creating a space as well. So that's something that I travel with constantly. And yet, when I first started out my journey on this planet, I was put in the foster system because my mom was white and my dad obviously wasn't. And it was not okay for her to have a little Black kid. And so there was a way in which the foster system in England was full of kids who looked just like me. They were not dark-skinned kids who had 2 Black parents. And in fact, having 2 Black parents at that moment in time would have felt like a privilege because you might have been able to stay at home and not be subjected to the violence of the system that I was in, right? And that was actually something that you've seen, you know, throughout that whole generation in England. There was a lot of kids who were biracial who were like put in the system precisely because there was no space for us to exist within our normal, you know, within a family context, you know. So, and then in the context of Nigeria, there's a whole other context because there's both the kind of external, like we've seen Black people in America who look light-skinned, right? That's kind of their mostly, this through the media. In my part of, my family's part of Nigeria, it's rural southeastern Nigeria. There's really pretty much nobody who's not Igbo. And all the families have been there. You know, if you walk around the extended village area, which is quite a number of, you know, area around my family, you'll just see a lot of Oparahs because everyone's just been there for 1,000 years. So it's like, you visualize it, right? And then of course, here I am, right? And look kind of different, got this other mother, there's other stories going on. And in that context, beauty doesn't look like this at all. It looks like a very dark-skinned Igbo. And there's a way in which there's a sort of suspicion somewhat around, okay, what story do you have and how do you get here? Although there's also just the general family thing of like, you're an Oparah, so that's it. So I just want to name that because, you know, skin colorism shows up and manifests in different ways in different places. We know in the Caribbean, then there's this concept of, you know, being high yellow or red, which signifies, you know, a lot of class privilege and so on. And so it's important for us to be accountable and to sort of identify how it's showing up in that particular moment. But I think it's also important not to tell a particular narrative about what that feels like. So for me growing up, I was always the darkest person in the room because I was surrounded by these white folks. And so then, you know, being able to find myself in Black community spaces with this diversity of skin tone, I then had to understand the politics of that and the ways in which, you know, that actually conveyed privilege now in ways that it hadn't when I was a kid growing up. So I always tried to start out, you know, Black community spaces, especially for our students, with an open-ended question. What did it look like for you? What was that experience? Rather than a sort of an assumption about what that looked like. And then digging a little deeper into, okay, so how does privilege look?
Oh, I think we may have temporarily lost Dr. Oparah. Maybe we give it another second and. Okay. I think maybe we can transition over to Dr. Mayorga. Oh, you are back. Okay, fantastic.
I'm sorry, but go ahead. I don't know when you got cut off, so we can move on. You got the gist, I'm sure.
Sure. You paused right as you were offering some framing questions for folks to consider. So thank you for that. And for you, Dr. Mayorga, I think it's important to talk about, right, that there are Black folks within the Latinx community and diaspora, and talking about those dynamics as part of the Black community, but also a broader community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also taking a positionality perspective, right? So I think also being aware that, you know, I'm a Latina, but also that I'm white passing, that particularly, you know, this isn't something that necessarily growing up in Miami, which is where I grew up, you know, people assume that I'm Cuban, but my family's from Central America, from Nicaragua specifically. And so, but that there's also privileges and, you know, sort of looking the way that I do. And so I think the way that I make sense of this is really thinking about sort of the the political obligations, right? So if I'm getting in the door, right, then you have to like make sure that the door is wide open after you're sort of the one that gets through, but also at the same time sort of interrogating these systems, right? Because I think as much as we know that academia is incredibly inequitable, I think we also buy into the merit part of it, right? And I think we're hesitant to sort of challenge that, the language of meritocracy or the logic of meritocracy, especially when we're benefiting from it. So I say this just to sort of say, I think these are, I'm a work in progress, just like many of us. And I'm actually working on a piece right now about whiteness and Latinx identity. But really, and this is where I'm learning from, like the Black Latinas No Collective, for example, who are really trying to center the Afro-Latinx experience and thinking through, sort of the pitfalls of this, pan-ethnic category. So, I'm teaching a Latinx sociology class next semester that I'm so excited to put together, and also making sure that it centers the experiences and the voices of Black and Indigenous Latinxes, who are not necessarily the first people that we think of when we think of this community. So, I name those things just to say, like, this is how I'm trying to work through it and think through it in my work, and really, again, just I'm still learning, I guess, is the short way I would say.
Thank you both.
Thank you both. And I have just a question that's a little bit more broad, and maybe for folks who are specifically wanting to know, like, okay, so we've been through this program, we've heard all of the things you have to say, and what can I take and bring it directly back to this campus? And so we have two folks in the chat asking, how can faculty, staff, and administration work together on an anti-racist agenda across silos and across campus? And I think I'm gonna go ahead and loop in the next question, which is just like, I would invite you, as you're answering that question, to kind of think about, like, on a lot of campuses, they are coming from a place where there might be like racist departments or like certain like racist faculty on campus. And so when we think about that on the larger sense, like, what can you guys offer?
Thank you so much. So whoever asked a question about coming together across silos, I'm very passionate about that. So thank you for bringing together in your question, faculty, staff, students. I would bring in alums as well. Our Black alums are a powerhouse for change on campus. So that's definitely a resource for building power. Well, I'll just give an example of something we're doing, because I think there are many different ways to do this. At Mills, we created this year an intersectional anti-racism team. And we brought in some trainers from the National Equity Project to do this training around what they call liberatory co-design. So this idea of designing our institutions, our institutions were designed precisely for the kinds of inequalities that we live in, right? And so we have to redesign them. So the idea is that you have to redesign them for liberation, but that that can't be done by the administration or even just by the faculty, right? That it has to be co-design. And so this is really a methodology they have for looking at all of our systems, our processes, our experiences, even our culture, our climate, and intentionally redesigning it together. And so that team actually brings together alums, faculty, staff, students, as well as a board member who's a Black board member who's been very involved in anti-racism work on the board, which is awesome, to think about these different areas and across silos. So one of the areas, for example, is student services with a focus on, accounts and financial aid. These are pain points for many Black students, right? But it's actually bringing together folks who are committed to anti-racism within financial aid, as well as students, as well as alums who've experienced it, and so on. So, and they're identifying and building different types of systems, and looking at where are the pain points, highlight and identify what are the pieces that are particularly creating pain for our Black students and faculty and staff. And then how can we unpack what they look like, and then rebuild them, redesign them. And I find that really exciting. Now, it's hard if you don't have the support of your senior administration to do that. Admittedly, it helps that I'm the provost, and it helps that our president is dedicated to racial and gender justice. But I still think that process can work in building power, even when you don't have that support at the top levels, because then you can advance an agenda collectively and together, which is very hard to resist when you actually have students and faculty and staff and alums, maybe a supportive board member coming together and saying, this is what we've identified. These are the things that are pushing our Black students out, preventing them from being successful. And these are the kind of pieces that we want to change. So I find that work really exciting and really possible. It's doable. It's not something that's sort of out there, impossible, and too big to even get started on.
Yeah, I would echo the same things, right? You build power with people, right? So it's strategizing with people either in your department, outside your department, and it's also coming up with very clear asks, right? I think that that's one of the things where I was hearing from one of the comments was people maybe not necessarily being sure how to reflect back on how their department is, is racist, or where they might be, how to incorporate an anti-racist agenda. And my department's doing that right now. And it was pushed forward by the 4 junior faculty before I started, and now I'm we lobbied the dean, and I'm now the equity liaison, which is basically the director of the anti-racism plan over the next 2 years, and we're implementing changes across the board. So it's thinking about the web page, right? How are we telling the story about who we are? How are we doing admissions? Let's look over our curriculum. So it's really doing sort of a full-scale evaluation. But it happened because those 4 faculty came together and said, this is what we need to be doing. So and they were all junior. So I think that's also just as one example of, you don't necessarily have to be, as Dr. Oparah was saying, the provost, right? If you, the power comes in sort of that collective action.
So I think we have time for one more question.
I have, Maya, I don't know if you feel strongly about anyone in particular.
Maybe let's do the one that was asked. So what, according to you, are some of the ways to engage indifferent privileged people into discussions involving racism? And I know that this isn't something we've talked about a ton during this conversation, but if there's one thing, like a takeaway that you want folks to have around that.
Well, first of all, nobody's indifferent. We're either supporting and uplifting systems of dominance and power so that we can be comfortable, or we're resisting them. There is no neutral. So just want to put that out there. And for me, what starts to happen is that the movement is moving so strongly and so visibly that people who are on the edges of that looking at it realize that they can't resist it anymore, right? That they begin to, and so you start finding that people who perhaps appeared indifferent, but actually were resistant, because I think that indifference is resistance, begin to come around to perhaps more modest shifts that previously they would have been opposed to, right? Because now the demands are way ahead of that. So to me, it's all about movement. Now, there is really great work by professor out of USF, Rhonda McGee, on the inside out work of anti-racism, where she actually talks about, and she's very patient, and this work is not for everyone, and it's not necessarily for me, but she talks about actually doing this deep mindfulness-based inside work of anti-racism with individuals who have that kind of resistance, because it oftentimes is rooted not only in their present situation, but in all the ways in which they have feelings. Let's just put it that way. That's important work for some folks. It's not my work to do, but I really deeply respect Professor McGee's work in that area. So I think there's 2 different angles that we can kind of come at it. But I tend to be like, the train is moving. We're on the road. That's the wrong metaphor. And eventually you're going to have to come along with us, because that's just where the institution is going.
Yeah, I think a lot of this too is if it's people close to your life, maybe outside of your professional capacity, right, who you're trying to bring along. I think that that's where the relationships really, and the patience is important. But again, those are loved ones who you are close to, and that's not necessarily the work that you need to do with everybody. So yeah, I think just to echo what Dr. Oparah was saying, that's what I tell my students who are asking me about, how do I talk to my parents about racism? How do I talk to, my uncle about this? And it's like, okay, well, you work with those, the intimate bonds you have, but it also, as Dr. Oparah said, you can't convince someone who doesn't want to engage, right? So I think if it's true engagement, that's beautiful and wonderful, but I think we also have to be honest about what the dynamic is.
Thank you for the great questions, everyone. And I'm sorry for any of the questions we weren't able to answer today.
No,
Yes. Yes, thank you both. I definitely echo Jasmine, and just feeling like this, after I get off this call, I'm just going to need to take some deep breaths myself to really let it all sink in. I want to name 2 things that are upcoming, and then I actually will invite us all to take a deep breath to sort of close the space and move into a different time, a different space, come back into our rooms that we're in. So one piece is, of course, gratitude again to my team in diversity training and education, Maya and Jasmine especially, who helped plan this program. Of course, Dr. Oparah, Dr. Mayorga, who agreed to be here and speak today, Veronica Lewis, who's our business manager. I feel like we don't often shout out the business manager, but but she does some awesome work in just trying to get things approved and transactions to be made. And then, of course, our captioner, Marie Fresh and Cassandra at Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services, who made this space more accessible today. We really, really appreciate you. And then the last piece is our next program in this series is called Decolonization. It's not a metaphor, pedagogy and praxis. That will be March 23rd. So there will be more information going out through the ODI newsletter about how to register for that program, as well as an evaluation for this one. So again, thank everyone, and I'll invite us all just in your own time, in your own way, to take one deep breath. Thank you so much. Everyone take care.
Thank you.